come to Professor Tony McMichael, who's a very familiar face among us. Tony's going to talk about climate change and the Millennium Development Goals, diversion or subversion. Tony McMichael is an Australian Fellow, NHMRC, National Health and Medical Research Council, at the National Centre for Epidemiology and Population Health at the ANU. When I say the word epidemiology, I'm always reminded of that time in Frontline when the presenter, that gormless creature, was trying to say the word investigative. And he kept practicing it, investigative, investigative, investigative. Well, I always have to practice epidemiology, epidemiology. Epidemiology, so there you are. During 1993 and 2007, Tony helped to lead the assessment of health risks for the Intergovernmental Panel, it's another one of those words, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. His books include Human Frontiers, Environments and Disease, and Climate Change and Human Health. Welcome, Tony McMichael.
Trying to master the technology here. Have you got the file? Right. Well, thanks for the introduction, Paul. Mary has stimulated our collective cerebral cortex. I'm also going to stimulate, I hope, the visual cortex. I've got a series of slides. It's a pretty big topic, climate change and the various ways that it's likely to impact on our capacity to achieve the Millennium Development Goals. And as we've heard in yesterday's discussion, we're already, of course, falling a long way short of where we should be at the halfway mark. I've raised the question as to whether climate change and some of the other great issues that have come onto the agenda over the last decade or so are in some way a distraction from dealing with the immediacies of deprivation, disadvantage, suffering around the world. Because quite often the argument, well, has been made, I think it's less made today, it has been made that worrying about the future distracts from dealing with the present. The sort of specious argument that Bjorn Lomborg made in the Skeptical Environmentalist. So I'm raising that question, is it a diversion, or do we need actually, I think in more informed ways, to understand how global environmental changes, including climate change, actually will tend to undermine our achievement of these Millennium Development Goals. In other words, subvert the achievement. So I'll be arguing that it's essentially a subversion. I just want to say up front that I also think we need to move on with our discussion about sustainability and what we mean by it. And I realise that coming from, here's that word again, Paul, the realm of epidemiology, and population health, you might expect me to have a view that actually consideration of human experience, well-being and health and survival ought to be at the centre of the discourse. But I really do think that we'll do better in terms of moving ahead, achieving sustainable ways of living, if we can locate human experience at the centre of the goal of sustainability. We talk about this triple bottom line of getting the economic, the social and the environmental conditions optimised. And clearly that's extraordinarily important, but they are not an end in themselves. We depend on those systems, and I'm speaking anthropocentrically, but we, the human species, depend on those things for our own optimised experience, health and survival. Otherwise, why have an economy? So this is the argument I'm making, that in human terms the central criterion of sustainability should be seen as the capacity of a society and its way of life to sustain well-being and good health of the population across generations into the indefinite future, and to do so without detriment to health in populations elsewhere. Okay, so that's a premise that underlies what I want to say. Now, I'm going to build this diagram up, and it's a bit of an ambitious attempt to explore the ways in which this process of climate change is going to bear on our achievement or non-achievement of the Millennium Development Goals. And you see on the left the familiar topics we've been talking about over the last 24 hours, to do with the relationships between economic development, economic growth, choices of technology, levels of consumption and waste generation, and at the bottom, a very important component of population dynamics. And you'll see there that demographic transition process summarized as societies undergo what we call modernization, and in the first instance reduce infant deaths, achieve longer lives, increased life expectancy, and the population of course grows. Later, birth rates will tend to fall, and some new equilibrium will be established. But in the meantime, of course, there has been and continues in many parts of the world to be rapid population growth. Okay, so these things are then converging on the pressures that we're putting on the natural world around us, and climate change is a dominant manifestation of this. You can follow the little track around the top as well. I hope that's self-explanatory, the peak oil bit. Now, in the health sciences, of course, we're very interested in the very many ways in which climate change will then have consequences for human health. There are the obvious direct impacts via heat waves and extreme weather events and so on. But shown there in that series of 5 red boxes, you can see a number of pathways via which the things that we depend on for long-term population health are going to be affected by this process. And then I've connected those up with the box on the right, which lists the 8 Millennium Development Goals. I've picked out the ones that are explicitly to do with health outcomes in blue, but of course we understand from things, again, that we heard yesterday, that the factors of poverty, education, particularly of young girls, have enormous consequences for many aspects of health outcomes. The thing I want to point to is the one in italics, number 7, environmental sustainability, because I think it's been most unfortunate that in this listing, and indeed in the original debate within the United Nations system, it was somehow seen as separate from those other goals. Almost an afterthought, came in at number 7. And the text that goes with the MDGs doesn't really explore the absolute fundamental role of the achievement of environmental sustainability with respect to our capacity to achieve each of these other goals. And if I were rearranging the diagram, I would do this. And say, without environmental sustainability, if we don't have the capacity to produce food, to have adequate supplies of clean, environmentally cleansed water supplies, to have natural constraints on infectious disease agents, to have all of those environmental buffers that protect us against the worst consequences of extreme events, and therefore, if we don't live in societies that are able to focus their attention on equitable social and economic development, then of course those problems will persist. So that's the sort of grand roadmap I want to show to illustrate the argument that in my view, climate change via these very many pathways is already subverting our capacity to achieve those very important Millennium Development Goals.